Let's talk about something a little different for this channel. This is an example of the type of video that I'd like to make more of when I have better equipment. I'd like to actually be able to more easily cite my sources and get quotes from notable people in the field and that kind of thing. But at the moment, I've just got a phone, so I'm just going to talk about this. We're just going to talk. This video is going to be about free will. So I was raised loosely Christian, Southern Baptist. And I remember when I was very, very young, I must have been like 4 or 5 years old, I learned about God, and I asked one of the adults around me about God. And my question was essentially, if God is everywhere and God created everything and God controls everything, then that means that God is within us and is controlling us as well. So that means that God is just doing all of this. Why do I feel like a separate person if God is doing everything in the universe? And the adult, I don't remember if it was my grandmother or my mom or whatever, but she was like, no. God gave us free will. That's why we have individuality, and that's why we can do things on our own. And I remember even at the time thinking, that doesn't make any sense to me, because what you're telling me about God is that he's this omniscient, all-powerful thing that created and controls everything, but for some reason he gave us free will. But we fit into this thing that he has 100% control over. If we're interfacing with that thing at all, then he should have 100% control over us too. So even from a very young age, the concept of free will didn't really make a lot of sense to me. And I became an atheist 6 or 7 years after that, when I was like 12 or something like that, around that age. And I mean, I went through a pretty typical journey for an atheist. I went down science rabbit holes, I went down physics, I went down math, I went down philosophy, and I have a special place in my heart for philosophy as a truth-seeking method, because it's very silly and inconclusive a lot of times, but it feels so important when you're thinking about it. So, I mean, I was a nihilist for a long time. The conclusion of nihilism is that nothing in the universe really matters, that there's no inherent meaning to anything in the universe. And simultaneously, while I was looking into nihilism, I was looking into things like Zen Buddhism and then later absurdism. And that was sort of my antidote to nihilism, which is that if the universe is meaningless, then at the very least, I can create meaning. And that sort of morphed into a belief that pretty much all meaning in the universe is created by sentient beings that create it for themselves. Otherwise, the universe would be completely void of meaning, because meaning is something that only happens within conscious experience. And so I went from a very young age not truly believing in free will, but I did understand the concept of it, to being very not spiritual, going very deeply into science and philosophy. And finally, I've landed sort of more on the spiritual side of things. I've sort of come back to spirituality in a way that suits me, my personal spiritual needs. So let's go over the types of belief about free will. Any good discussion about free will is going to start by defining free will. And this is actually probably the hardest part about the whole discussion. Free will is connected to a sense of agency. It is an individual's sense that they are not only separate from the rest of the universe and the world around them, but that their decisions were made internally and personally and freely without influence from that outside world. That is how I would define free will. And I think, you could nitpick. Some philosophers may come in and nitpick and come up with their own definitions that are going to be somewhat similar. But generally speaking, it's when an individual agent freely makes decisions. That's free will. Somebody that believes that free will is a real thing that exists is a libertarian. They believe that our actions as human beings are completely separate from the outside world. They can affect the outside world, obviously, but that our decisions and our actions are made separate from the outside world. That anything could happen out there, and it would still be up to you to make the decision to take action in one way or another. The opposite of this belief is hard determinism. Determinism is the idea that the universe and everything that happens within it has been determined, either by some greater force or just by the laws of physics, essentially. And there's a lot of evidence for determinism and very little evidence for libertarianism, scientifically speaking. Of course, evidence for determinism is we have neuroscience. We understand more and more about the brain all the time. And what we understand about the brain now is that our consciousness seems to arise from the actions of neurochemistry, neurobiology within our brains and our nervous systems. And these nervous systems are intricately tuned to react to the outside world. And so even our decision-making process as a higher order process in the brain is still influenced heavily by the outside world. Decisions that we make are not made in a void, essentially. We make decisions based on the information that we have outside, and if the information outside changes, perhaps our decisions would change as well. This, to me, is the strongest evidence for determinism because it connects directly to the function of free will in our brain, right? It explains directly what is happening in our brains that allows us to make decisions in the first place. Right, what we understand now, or what I understand, and keep in mind, I've never been to college or anything. I've studied neuroscience in the sense that I've read papers and I've watched like college level lectures on YouTube, but I've only gone as deep as a layman can go, pretty much. So I don't fully understand neuroscience, and I'm definitely not an expert, but what I think we understand about neuroscience is that the decision-making part of the brain is a higher order thought process. It happens in something called the basal ganglia, or at least it's very highly associated with the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia is connected to a system of what's called CTSC loops. It goes from the outside of the body to some stuff on the inside of the brain, to the lower order thought processes, to the higher order thought processes, and then back out to the body. This is sort of the flow of information and activity in the brain. And part of this flow is the basal ganglia, which is highly associated with decision making. We've also been able to show that people actually make decisions some amount of time before they even know that they've made a decision, and certainly before they act on that decision. It's that study where they would have participants decide whether to press a button on the left or on the right, and they would monitor their brain activity and find that the person actually decided to press the button on whichever direction, like a few milliseconds before the button was pressed and before the conscious experience of knowing that they're going to press the button happens. And then, of course, there's physics. You could say that our bodies and therefore our nervous systems are under the laws of physics, right? We cannot operate outside of the laws of physics. So whatever happened at the moment of the Big Bang pretty much set everything in motion, and now we cannot escape the flow of physics. So there's a lot of evidence for determinism. Evidence for libertarianism is pretty scarce, and a lot of it is very speculative. A lot of it is basically like, well, maybe there's something that we're missing. Maybe there's some information we don't know that could be the link between the determined universe and our bodies and our physical, construction and everything, our biology, and the actual free part of free will. So maybe there's something in quantum mechanics, maybe free will is an emergent phenomenon. I mean, we don't even fully understand what consciousness is and how it arises. So maybe there's something that we're missing, right? And I feel like I have free will, and so therefore it must be real. That's the evidence for libertarianism. It's not very strong evidence in my mind. And of course, there's more details. There's different, nuanced aspects of the belief that people are going to have separate from each other. For example, there are some hard determinists that believe because free will doesn't exist, for example, that we shouldn't shame and blame and punish people, that we should completely reform the justice system so that it's more of a rehabilitation system, enact wide-sweeping socio-political changes in the world to reflect the fact that free will doesn't exist. And there are some people that believe this about free will, about determinism, and also believe that we shouldn't be praising people for doing good things because that also wasn't their free choice to make, and it was essentially the universe acting through them or something like that. But most people go through their lives pretty much understanding, I have this sensation of free will. People tell me that I can make decisions, and so free will is a thing. Even if they don't necessarily have the words free will to describe it, even if they've never been in this debate or this philosophical discussion, even if they've never seen a whiff of it, most people just naturally feel as if free will exists. It's an experience that we have as conscious beings. And of course, that has led to a society that shames, blames, and punishes people for doing bad things, even though those things may or may not have been within their control. We act as if they were, right? If somebody commits a murder, we act as if they made that decision and that they could have made the decision not to commit that murder. And so we punish them for it. And there are determinists that would like to do away with that system of punishment. At the same time, people who fall into hard determinism can also easily fall into nihilism and depression. And there is this sentiment among people that have difficulty accepting determinism of like, well, if free will doesn't exist, then why aren't people just going out and committing crimes all the time and without fear of punishment? Because they can say, if anybody can say, I didn't make that decision freely, then people are now have license to do whatever they want to do. So these are both of these ideas can in their own way be very, very harmful to an individual and to society. Take the example of somebody that is a libertarian. They believe in free will, and maybe they are having a difficult time in life. Maybe they, because of their external circumstances, are having a difficult time achieving their goals, but they believe that it's 100% within their power to achieve their goals and that the outside world has really nothing to do with it. And so they will shame themselves, they will blame themselves, and they will feel bad because, and maybe even get depressed because they feel like a failure, because their locus of control is so strong that everything they do comes back to them. And that's a very selfish way of thinking. That's a very almost paranoid way of thinking that everything you do, everything that happens in your life was because of your own decisions, when that's not necessarily the case. And I think most libertarians do believe in an element of luck and sort of randomness in their life and in the universe. But at its most extremes, that is the kind of thing and mindset that libertarianism can lead to. And it's something that I've experienced myself and something I've seen other people experience as well. But you can also imagine a person who's a hard determinist and that doesn't believe in free will at all, and so they have zero locus of control. They don't think that they have any control over their life whatsoever. They're just following the whims of the wind, wherever it may take them. And that can lead them down some very dangerous and difficult paths where they end up using their body and their consciousness to enact terrible things, commit crimes, commit selfish acts and things like that because, well, it's just my biology acting, right? And they may come up with all kinds of reasons why their actions were determined from the very beginning and try to use that as an excuse for their bad actions. So you can imagine easily both of these types of people, and they're on opposite ends of a spectrum, and they're both facing some kind of difficulty because of that. There is, however, a more nuanced take on free will. Compatibilism is the idea that the illusion of free will, the sensation of free will, is perfectly compatible with a factual lack of free will. So as humans, we do make decisions. Like, that is a function of our brains, and I believe personally that the illusion of free will, the sensation of having free will, is a natural conclusion to the decision-making process in the brain. Neurobiologically speaking, there is a time-based process that happens over a small amount of time within our brains every single moment of our lives before we make a decision that takes in information from the outside world, collects that, processes it, adds, concepts to it and things like that, and we think about it, right? And then through that thinking, we make a decision. And that process that happens in our brain of taking in information and making a decision about it feels to us as if it's free because it's happening and we're experiencing it. It feels like something that we are doing because we identify with the action of making a decision. And I think that's absolutely perfectly natural. I think that's something that the human brain has evolved to do. I think it's evolutionarily adaptaceous for us, that it's a good thing for us. as a pre-social or a eusocial species. It's actually some debate about our level of sociality as a species, which I might make a video about that too in the future. But the idea of an illusion of free will in a decision-making process, it makes a lot of sense. In fact, in my experience, it almost seems as if the decision-making process, it only feels like free will when we identify with it. Otherwise, if you can somehow remove your identity from the process of decision making and truly believe that it's something that's just happening in your brain without your input, then you can disassociate from the sensation of free will and make it completely disappear. And nothing will really change. There are actually people, this is called depersonalization. There are people that walk through life without a sensation of free will, and they continue to make decisions because they don't identify with those decisions. They believe within themselves that the decisions that they're making are essentially just automatic processes. And these people don't go around, generally, they don't go around committing crimes and things like that. They are, generally speaking, pretty normal people that you could talk to and you wouldn't even really know that they're depersonalizing and that they don't believe they're really present for the conversation. But if you were to ask them about free will, they would say they don't have a sense of free will. So compatibilism is sort of a middle road. It is sort of an acceptance of hard determinism, but with the caveat that, free will is a very compelling and natural and even necessary sensation for us to have. And it's most likely good for us to go through life with a sensation of free will, even if intellectually, cognitively speaking, we don't really believe that it exists. This belief isn't going to change a whole lot about an individual's life on a day-to-day basis, because they're going to go through life still thinking about things, still experiencing the decision-making process, just like everybody else does. And at the same time, they may have another layer of thought that happens on top of that that allows them an outside perspective on their decisions. They will understand that, why am I making this decision, right? They'll ask themselves, why is my brain taking in this information and making this conclusion about what I should do? And it will give them, instead of being immersed in this decision-making process, it will give them an opportunity to have some distance while still engaging with the process. And finding this balance can allow an individual to pretty much have a normal life, but understand themselves and even understand other people and the decisions they make better. Compatibilism as an idea, I believe, can bring people more in harmony with the whole of the universe, right? We are, factually speaking, pieces of the universe. We're made of the same stuff. We're just bags of matter and energy, just like everything else is. And somehow we happen to be conscious because we have this neurobiology that's very complex and has this sense of consciousness and this sense of free will that emerges from it. But we are just pieces of the universe. And it seems very clear to me that our decisions are heavily influenced by our environment, the things that we know, our memories, our experiences, and everything that happens to us as individuals plays into that decision-making process and affects our sense of free will. And so stepping back from identifying with my decisions has allowed me personally to have a wider perspective on my place in the world and on my place in the universe, right? Thinking back on my life, why did I make all those decisions? Why did I make that choice? Why did I make that choice? So what is this like? Like how do you actionably be a compatibilist? What is the performance of compatibilism like? Well, again, I think it's very subtle and it's not going to have a massive impact on somebody's life and on their actions. But I think the main aspect of it is really just the understanding, right? Just thinking about it. Every time a decision is made or contemplated, having that understanding of determinism, but at the same time, the illusion of free will is very important. And this is what's happening in my head, in my brain, in my mind. In my life, in my experience, this idea of compatibilism sort of has led to more moments of effortless living, right? Previously, when I made decisions, especially like large decisions or impactful decisions, I would end up thinking about them for a long time afterwards, ruminating on them, wondering if, how it would have turned out differently if I made a different decision and all this. And these are completely pointless things to think about because the decision has already been made. It's in the past, and whatever circumstance and information I had at the time, I'm no longer in that circumstance, and now I have more information. So I'm going to make a different decision in the future if I even end up back in that circumstance. So thinking about our decisions can be helpful. In the modern world, however, there's so much changing constantly all the time that most of the time we're not going to end up back in that situation again, making the same decision or having the opportunity to make a different one. And so this constant rumination, constant thinking about decisions and wondering how could I have done this better is not very helpful. Instead, I have replaced it with a sense of effortless action, which may sound familiar if you've studied Taoism, if you've looked into Taoism at all. Wu Wei is the concept of effortless action, and it's a very paradoxical idea, but it is something that you can experience. I think the main difference between compatibilism and hard determinism is that compatibilists will understand that there's more going on in the brain besides just the decision-making process. We also think about our decision-making process. And that thinking about the decision-making process can help us make decisions better in the future. But it can go haywire and lead to a libertarian sort of identification with the decisions, which can lead to shame and blame. And so a compatibilist will sit somewhere in the middle, right? A compatibilist will go through life making decisions, forgiving themselves and forgiving other people for making decisions that may have affected them negatively, and also going through the process of thinking about those decisions so that better decisions can be made in the future. And from my understanding, this is all automatic. This is completely all automatic. And instead of my brain stopping at the hard determinism point where it's like, okay, well, I make decisions and I don't need to think about them, and decoupling that thought process from the decision-making process. Instead, these two processes have come together and they're now collaborating in my mind better than they ever did before. And this has overall led to a greater sense of peace, a greater sense of harmony, a greater understanding of myself and of other people. And of course, I don't go through life experiencing excessive amounts of shame or nihilism. So I have the benefits of libertarianism and hard determinism without the drawbacks of either one. And that's what compatibilism can offer. That's the utility of compatibilism. That can offer a more balanced view of yourself and your place in the world and the decisions that you make. So that's that. Like I said, I'd like to make more videos like this, better videos once I have the resources. I am homeless. I live in my car at the moment. I'm trying to get a van so I can improve my situation and be able to make videos like this a little bit better. I'd like to just be able to have this discussion on a more detailed level. Consider checking out my other videos. Consider subbing to the channel if you'd like to follow me, if you want to see more like this, if you want to see the channel get better. If you learned anything, if you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like, and thank you so much for watching and have a peaceful day.